Hi there, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur in Plein Air magazine. I love to paint snow, but painting snow isn't easy. Getting the temperature right, getting the shadows right, getting the edges right, there's a lot to it. And there's nobody better than Dave Santillanes, who lives out west and paints in the snow all the time. And this one is called Winter Landscapes with Dave Santillanes. I hope you enjoy this segment.
If painting snow seems intimidating to you and you're not exactly sure how to approach it, this will be the perfect workshop for you. Hi folks, my name is Dave Santillanes, and for today's demo I'm going to be painting snow. And a snow scene brings about its own set of difficulties. Number one, if you're painting in it, it's cold. But aside from the physical limitations of painting in snow, there's also some things that you learn about snow that you may not anticipate going into a snow painting. And we're going to talk about those things, some very eye-opening things about painting snow. And within that, we'll also cover atmosphere and all the other elements of a landscape painting. So before we get started with actually painting it, let's take a look at the scene itself and analyze what we're about to do, how to look at colors across atmospheric elements. And so let's pop over to the computer and we'll analyze this scene. Okay, so I'm back at the computer right now, just taking a look at that scene from the perspective of what if we came upon the scene outdoors? How do we analyze that scene in terms of paint? So I'm in Photoshop, and what I want to do is kind of show this breakdown of shadow family and light family. And when I come upon a scene like this, I try to divide that scene immediately into light family and shadow family. And if you can do that, you're simplifying the scene before you even begin painting. So if I'm looking at this scene, trying to identify the shadow families, the first thing I look at is the darkest dark on that far mountain. And that happens to be this color. This is a direct Photoshop sample of this color. And notice how light it looks surrounded by black. Surrounded by white, it feels much darker. And I can change that background of that swatch to white to give us a little bit more of an idea of how dark that shape is. But notice it changes. The feeling of that color swatch changes as I flip from black to white. That's important to note as we develop those first colors. Now moving forward in the landscape, we come to the second ridge moving forward, and we can see that it is darker. It's both darker and warmer. So the darkest dark on this plane is warmer and darker than the darkest dark on that distant mountain. And then as we continue moving forward, this third level of atmosphere, you can see how warm and dark that is by comparison. And again, this is just the shadow. We're trying to pick apart just that tiny little sliver of a shadow and coming up with a color for it. And then finally, we've got this dark of this tree, which if I switch back to black, we can see it's not the full, it doesn't approach black. It's still lighter than black, but quite dark when you compare it to white. And it's, of course, much warmer, much darker than those first shadow shapes that we put in. And now we're going to use these shadow shapes. Once we decide what they are, we're going to use these shadow shapes to develop our painting initially, to lay in those initial shadow shapes. Okay, now that we've analyzed the landscape and we know what we're doing, we've got a good game plan going into this painting. Now it's time to get started, but before we do, let's talk about some of the must-have supplies. Obviously, of course, you need something to paint on. The surface I use, and I use it indoors and outdoors, is medium density fiberboard, MDF. And I prime it with stuff you can get at a hardware store. It's a household primer sealer. But before I lay that down, I use an acid-free glue called Plein, and I'll start the priming process with this acid-free glue and put it over the top of that MDF just to seal it. And then I'll add the primer on top of that. And I use a primer called BIN, for priming the surface. And really it's just a nice slick surface that responds a lot like a high-end linen. But as part of that surface, I found that bristle brushes aren't effective on it. It basically turns it into a scratch board. So what I've done is purchase a bunch of softer brushes. These are synthetics, and they're soft, shorter hair. I use brights mostly, and I'll use various sizes, but I start with a large brush, and by the end of the painting I get into much smaller ones. So this is a number 4 bright, but the softer brushes work with this surface, so your supplies have to kind of match what you're painting on. Another important tool, I think, is a mixing knife, and this knife has a nice long edge, and it helps you mix bigger puddles of paint early on. The knives with the pointy edge make it really hard to dip into the paint and grab a lot of paint. So I find a nice mixing knife really important. And then of course you have paper towels, kind of a must. I think every artist has their own preference. These are soft fabric like Viva rolls. And then of course solvent, and I use Gamsol. There's other solvents out there. Those are my supplies. I don't use medium. I don't really add anything to the paint other than the paint. So that's what I work with in the studio and in the field. So now let's talk about the paints I use, the colors, and basically the general layout of my palette. Basically my palette's arranged from warm to cool. And yellow is the warmest color on my palette. Blue, interestingly enough, is the second coolest. Titanium white is actually the coolest color on the entire palette. So I use cad yellow, and this is cad yellow medium. This is yellow ochre, cadmium orange, cadmium red medium, transparent red oxide, and this is alizarin crimson, viridian, cerulean blue, and ultramarine blue. And then of course I squeeze out a long tube of titanium white. And one of the most important colors on my palette is this medium gray. It's kind of a neutral gray, and what I'll use that is to mute chroma in some of those intense colors. And we'll talk more about that gray later on in the painting. But that's essentially my palette. Now let's go ahead and get started painting. Okay, now we know what we're going to paint. We've got a game plan for the painting. We've got our supplies. Now it's time to start laying in those shadow shapes from background to foreground. So let's get started. And the first color we need to mix is that background, the darkest dark on that background plane. So I'm going to start with ultramarine blue. And I've got my cold gray here. And what that cold gray does is it just mutes that blue, the chroma of that blue. And that's going to help push that blue back. As things go back in the distance, as we talked about, they get cooler, but they also get grayer. Because if we get too blue, that chroma is going to pull that blue forward. And we want to keep it back. Now what I mix here gives me a starting point, but ultimately it's going to be how does it look on the canvas? How does it look in relationship to the white of the canvas? That's my first. So I'm just going to throw a little test color there. And to me it feels a little bit too dark. So let's add a little bit of titanium white. And against the white of the canvas, it's going to feel darker than it does against the gray of the palette. That's just a natural thing. It feels lighter here than it does on the canvas because it's surrounded by different colors. And this is an example of color relationships right there. You surround a color by different colors and it changes your perception of that color. I'm going to add a little bit more chroma. Now you noticed on the snow scene I didn't tone the canvas in any way. If I did tone the canvas, it wouldn't be with transparent red oxide, it'd be with maybe a grayed out alizarin. And maybe I'll do that just to give me a little color in that foreground. Alizarin's very strong, so you gotta go easy with it. So I'm just gonna quickly give a little warm tone in the foreground. Nothing major, just enough to tone that canvas a little bit. Because these color notes will come through once we get the snow on top of this. That also helps, one of the things, and we'll talk about this more, it'll help us establish a value range for that snow. Snow has a surprisingly dark value range. I mean, darker than we would expect. So. Okay, so once I have this initial mixture and I'm happy with it, then we'll use that to draw where things are going to go. And this initial drawing is not going to be a white knuckle, tight rendering. We're just trying to figure out where we want to place things. So I'm going to have a tree here. This will be about where that horizon line is. This will be the mountain. We'll have a tree here. And then a little stream coming through. And the stream will go off the bottom edge of the canvas. And we can shift this if we find it necessary. But that'll be the overall layout. And the beauty with oil is we can shift things if we need to, if they don't feel right, if we decide later on that we want to move these elements, as long as we don't have too much detail on any of these shapes really. They're easily movable. So now let's just get that background in. Now, sometimes we'll build a color and then find out once we get a big solid block of it down that it actually reads different as a big shape. And then we can adjust it if we need to. But this is that mountain in the background. And I'm painting it as if it was entirely in shadow and entirely made up of that darkest dark element, which is the rock. Now, of course, there's a lot of snow on this mountain, but we don't have to indicate that yet. I always have my eraser handy. Now that is going to be enough to indicate that mountain. Now the next step is that next shadow shape coming forward. And there's a line of trees on that distant plain. And those trees have a shadow. I mean, part of those trees are being hit by light, but there's a shadow element to those trees. And that's the most difficult part of this approach sometimes, is to find the shadow. A couple things I know about that shadow. One is it's darker than the distant shadow, or the distant darkest dark. The other thing is it's warmer. So I'm going to create a very similar blue. I'm starting with ultramarine blue, and then I'm using gray to warm it. Now we think, well, you know, I've always thought we need to introduce the complement of that color to warm it. The problem is, if you use orange to warm this blue, you warm it so much that it leaps miles forward. We want to be more subtle. So by using gray, we're warming it, but it's subtle and it comes slowly forward rather than leaping forward. Now once I have this color down, I'm going to test it and just see. That's nice. I can actually lighten that a little bit. It doesn't have to get that dark that soon. But I think the temperature is going to be nice. So let's, and these are just exploratory marks I'm making. Just trying to see if that color is going to work, and I think it will. There's no pressure. I don't have to love it yet. There's a lot of putting down marks that are wrong just to figure out what I need to do to make them right. And I think that I'm going to go with that. If we have to adjust it later, we can. Okay, that I think that's going to work. But it's like a lot of things, getting it wrong isn't the end of it. It's really the beginning of figuring out how to get it right. Okay, now working through. Now we have another shape here to get in, another shadow shape. And that's going to be this tree. Now, the tree here has a lot of different parts of the shadow. What we're looking for is the darkest part. Now, oftentimes in the foreground, the very darkest part will be black, but those elements of black are so few and far between in a landscape. They mostly involve the deepest crevices of a rock or something of that sort. So we're not looking for black here. Although what I'm going to do is mix a black so at least I'll know, I guess in this case, what to avoid. So here's my black. It's transparent red oxide, ultramarine blue, mixed together proportionally, so it's about half of each. And the reason I like to mix my own black is then I can shift it cool or warm just based on those two mixtures. If I need a warm black, just add more transparent red oxide. So this is as dark as I can go. I don't want to go that dark for that tree. So I'm going to pull some gray in because that tree shadow needs to be fairly warm compared to the blues. I'm going to add a little bit of transparent red oxide. And let's get a little bit more. And then a little bit of the black just to key that value down a little bit. I'm just curious. You know, it looks one way on my palette, but let's see how it looks. Notice how much darker it looks on the canvas. I'm going to go with that for now because it's a good bit darker. You can see how much darker it is than those background shadows. And it's warmer. And those are the keys to pulling something forward, but we also want to keep this tree back behind some of these shadows. So I want the pure blacks to be maybe at the edge of this creek, this winter creek. And one thing that I'm doing here, I'm not painting a tree trunk and a tree. I'm painting a shape. And to get that shape dark enough, let's drag through there. Oh. I keep my solvent on the ground because it's really a carryover from painting outdoors where I knock my solvent jar over and it destroys my palette mixtures. So I keep it on the ground, and I do it in the studio now too. So this tree is going to break that plane. And this doesn't, again, we're just painting atmospheric detail right now. You know, we're not really looking to paint this tree with any degree of precision. We're painting atmosphere. And now, if all goes well, we've got room for another layer here. And this black is really just going to be in, you know, very few areas. But to double check, just to make sure I haven't gone too dark, let's put a little bit on there. That's really close, so I'm going to lighten some areas of this just a little bit. What makes, in our reference material, what makes this feel so dark is the fact that it's surrounded by lighter elements. So value has a relativity to it too. If you want something to feel light, you surround it by darks. If you want something to feel warm, you surround it by cool notes. So that these little slivers of shadows that ultimately end up being the shadow of this tree will feel darker because the trunk will be lighter. Everything's relative in a painting. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, and then the darkest parts of this painting will be these little slivers of dark in this stream. But I've indicated a bit larger just to give us an example of that, that relationship. And I'll do that a lot too. I'll establish some of these shadows larger than they will end up being, just to give me this relationship comparison throughout the landscape. So that's basically the shadow structure to this painting. That right there is all we need to do to set up the entire structure atmospherically of this painting. And there's no linear detail right now, it's all atmospheric detail, but it's done with some precision. Precision as far as making sure those color relationships are accurate. So we'll step back, analyze this, make sure these colors are working, and then we'll get on to the next step. Okay, so now we've got the basic structure of the painting set. Now it's time to go into these shadow shapes and modify them. We have some snowfields on that far mountain that are inside the shadow family. So we're going to get into that detail right now. But we're going to stick with the shadows, get those completely set, and then start adding the light family. So one of the first things we're going to do is solidify this color. You know, when I'm working quickly through those shadow shapes, sometimes I'll get them too juicy and we get too much white showing through, and that changes the value of it. And so we want to definitely solidify that. And I'll get a fairly big brush here. I think it's a 12. I've got the size 16 in reserve when I really need to fill in a big shape. So I'm just getting rid of some of these white streaks just to give me a better idea of what this value range is. Cleaning things up a little bit. Now, for snow follows the same physics of light and shadow that any other object does. It just, snow being white reveals color much better than to our eye than other objects that aren't white. So with snow, what you know, one way to think about it is warm light, cool shadows when it's lit by sun. So warm light on snow involves not just titanium white, but titanium white and a warming element, such as transparent red oxide, just something to warm that light. Or gray, you know, gray is going to warm white because white is the coolest color on the entire palette. So gray would be a nice way to warm a white. To cool a white, you're looking at this end of the palette. Blues. We'll create both. We're going to create a warm white and a cool white. And with that, we'll be able to create the feeling of light and shadow. But since we're still in the shadow family, what I'm going to do is scoop this a little bit over, what I'm trying to do is create all my shadows on this side. All my light family will be here. And that'll be the way to organize my palette. And I've found just over time that if my palette gets too chaotic, my painting gets chaotic as well. So this is my attempt to organize it. And that's come from years of outdoor painting. So this is the mountain shadow. Now the snow part of that mountain shadow isn't a huge degree lighter. It's slightly lighter. So this would be too much. And I'm going to add just a touch of gray there. But by comparison, the shadow of the mountain snow is cooler than the rock parts of that mountain, and a little bit lighter. So those are my only guiding principles in making this color is, okay, it's cooler and lighter, but to what degree is a matter of observation. We know the general part of that, but the specifics will be based on observation. Now I just want to touch just a little part of this to the canvas and see where we're at. That, I think, is going to work. It might be a little bit light. Let's darken that just a bit. So you can see, even knowing, you know, a bit about the physics of it, there's still a lot of room for observation. That's why no painting is formulaic. You can, you know, it's just like the learning anatomy of an animal. It's going to help you, but you still have to observe what's going on with that animal. So now I feel pretty confident with this color. Not that we can't change it if we need to. And now I'm just indicating those snowfields in the shadow. And you can use this color to draw too. We've got a nice angle line through here that we can use to come into that tree a bit. So we're still very much in the shadow. We also still have this rock color, that distant rock color, if we need it to help us draw. You know, that shadow is made up of snow and rock. And we have both right here on the palette, snow and rock. This scene is inspired by an area near Telluride, Colorado, and you get a lot of snow there. And what I love about it is it really creates these little simple, you know, poetic scenes where, you know, very calming lines and big shapes. And once we get these lines fairly close to where we want them, then we can analyze it a little bit better. and see what needs to change, what we're happy with. But I'm using the rock now to shape the snow and vice versa. Two brushes kind of filled with different elements of this painting. Now there's also where the sun is hitting some of the snow. Obviously it's going to get warmer. Some of that warmth is going to bleed over into the snow, but we're going to worry about that once we get the light family. So we're still working in very basic, in a very basic sense right now. Here's another area of shadow snow. Now I'm using my reference material really strictly as a guide. I'm not, measuring every placement because I don't think that's important. What I'm trying to do is respond to what feels good compositionally. And I am going to raise this tree just a little bit. So the bottom of the tree will be a little bit higher than where I started. Just feels a little better. Now let's modify some of that snow a little bit more with some lighter areas where the reflected light is hitting the snow a little bit more. And then if you get curious just to see how light you can go with, if you need to, scrape back through and that at least gives you an indication of the value structure. And I think that'll work. I mean, I don't have any information yet telling me it's wrong. Sometimes that information comes later in a painting and leads to a bit more work, but it's better than that information never getting there. Let me re-indicate. Allow some sharp lines back there too. Some, I shouldn't say sharper lines, because that keeps those big shapes. If you get too fussy, you start to lose the edge of the snow versus the rock. Now that, I'm fairly happy with that. And then there'll be some shadows on the snow themselves, and those shadows just get a little bit more intense. So the blues just get higher chroma as they cast shadows in the foreground. So let me build a slightly higher chroma blue. And we'll put that about here because it's on that plane. You know, I'm building these as separate planes coming forward. And this will be the shadow cast by the tree onto the snow. It's going to be fairly high chroma, but we don't want it too intense. There's definitely a fine line there. And again, we can build this shadow a bit bigger than it will actually be. Okay. Let me look one more time. I'm going to modify the tops of this shadow compared to the bottom of the shadow. You know, the sun hits a mountain just like it hits any other object. It's going to hit it more at the top and then slightly darker at the bottom. So let's sort of lighten that. We want to, you know, we have some parameters that we want it to be a little bit lighter, but we don't want it to be lighter than the snow. So we've given ourselves some limitations. Whoops. Now we do want to keep this mountain back behind this shape of trees here. Sometimes adjusting these shadows can seem like we're being a little bit obsessive about, okay, we've got to, you know, make sure this fits into that and that fits into this. And it's important. I think at this stage it's vital to get those relationships reading correctly, because once you get details on any of these elements, it becomes very difficult to make those same changes, because you have to destroy hundreds and thousands of trees that you've painted. Now it's okay that at this point that everything seems very blue, because once we get those warms in, that's when we start to build this as a painting. If painting snow seems intimidating to you and you're not exactly sure how to approach it, this will be the perfect workshop for you. Hi, I'm Dave Santillanes, and welcome to my workshop. In this workshop, we're going to be talking about snow, but part of that discussion is going to reveal some surprising things about snow. First off, we'll find out just how great a value range is within snow. We often think of snow as just one value, white, but there's a surprising level of value transitions within snow. We're also going to learn that snow is not white, that there are a surprising degree of color changes within snow, and all of that helps develop the form that is snow. And of course, we're going to discuss the other things inherent in a landscape: atmospheric elements, atmospheric transitions from foreground to background. All of that will be included in this workshop. I hope this workshop inspires you to get out there and paint, even if it's in the snow, even if it's in the cold, enduring the elements, because the satisfaction of capturing that scene on canvas is worth the trouble.
Well, that is a segment from Winter Landscapes with Dave Santillanes, and you can learn more about the full-length video at painttube.tv. We have a discount for you today, always in the comments section. Just grab that discount code and use it when you check out. Now, let's go right to our interview with Dave Santillanes. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher and founder of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazine. I like to interview artists and understand them and get into their heads, and today we have a fantastic landscape artist for you, Dave Santillanes. Dave, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Eric.
We're pretty excited to have you in the studio today.
I'm honored.
We're the ones who are honored here. So you just recently won a national award, top award for the Plein Air Salon art competition, which means you were basically anointed the best painter of the year. How does that feel?
Overwhelming. I mean, it just blew us away. And we found out when we were in Crested Butte on a painting trip out in Crested Butte. And that was how we started off our trip. So that was an amazing award. I've been entering it for years and getting better the entire time. And to finally reach that pinnacle is, it's a euphoric feeling. I mean, it really was the biggest award I've ever won.
Well, and you got a $15,000 check, a great big one.
Yes.
Which is pretty cool.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. You said something that I think is an important distinction to make for people watching, is that you entered it for years getting better and better. Tell me about that.
Well, I think the whole journey of being an artist, I feel like, is about getting better as a painter. And getting better, I think, means different things to different people. To me, it means not just getting technically better, but my vision of what I want to paint also gets, I would say, better, as in I'm more true to myself. I think maybe I started off painting what I thought, would impress the art world, and then you just start being true to yourself and painting what you feel right about. And I think that's when you make the biggest leaps and jumps as an artist.
That's also interesting to think about, because as you know, I'm a painter, and there are these thoughts that go through our head, and the thoughts are different for everybody at different stages of their life. But you said something about, I want to show people what I can do. I want to impress other people. And I remember being in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and you see all these beautiful Dutch still life florals, where they have a mosquito on the leaf of the floral with a little mosquito shadow, and you think, they're just showing off. They're just showing off.
Yeah, and I think it was more a thing when I was young, trying, like we were saying, trying to impress. But I've been finding out, when you first start off, you want to do it all. You see a landscape. I always joke with my students, I would bring out my viewfinder and try and paint everything that's in that little square and paint it with detail, and basically try and capture the scene like a camera. And it was most often a failure, but it was also a failure for me in concept. I really didn't want to do that. And now I practically ignore the viewfinder, and I look at the entire landscape when I paint, and I'll take something from this side just for design, something over here, and use that scene as inspiration, but not, I'm not trying to capture it like a camera.
So do you think that's part of the journey that a lot of artists go through? Do you think starting out in, dare I say, photorealism or some variation of that, is that the kind of a normal thing where people start? Because some people, continue in that direction.
I think it probably varies from artist to artist, but that's, a lot of the artists I know kind of started on that path. And I think for me, what got me out of that was I stopped painting from photos. I started getting outdoors and started to really see the difference between what a camera captures and what's really out there. And then over time, my philosophy of what I wanted to paint changed. And it was a natural thing just from being outside. And my philosophy changed into, I don't want to capture everything exactly like a photo. I want to make it a painting and focus on design and focus on atmosphere and focus on these other elements. And I can do things that the camera can't. I can move a tree from over here and put it where I want it.
Yeah. Live in-person Photoshop.
Yes, exactly.
In paint.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's been a great journey in that. And then you start to get to a place where you really feel like you can take off. You know, you get to that point where you really feel like you can take off.
I've had numerous painters talk to me about what happened to them once they started going outdoors, how it impacted the way they saw the world and it impacted their painting. How did it impact you?
Well, on top of the things I talked about there, I mean, it was a natural thing for me because I grew up in an outdoorsy family. We'd backpack all the time. So it was a natural thing just to throw my paints on my back and bring them along. And but what it teaches you that if you're studying only from photos, you're missing half of the information out there. You're missing that direct observation. And I tell my students now, it honestly doesn't matter if you get a good painting, because just that hour and a half, 2 hours of staring at a scene, you're picking up things that you're not going to pick up staring at a photo for the same amount of time. So I think there's formal things that you pick up, objective things you pick up, and then there's the other part that you become part of that scene as a landscape painter painting outdoors. You become part of that story that you're painting. And it's one of those things that if you're driving by holding the camera out the window, snapping photos, you're not really part of that environment. Right. But I think immersing yourself in the environment for 2 hours, you become the expert of that little piece of real estate.
Well, there's a scene in the movie Vacation where Chevy Chase and his family they start out in Chicago and they drive all the way across the country. They get to the Grand Canyon, they look at it and they go,
yeah,
and then they leave, right?
Yeah.
And I lived a life similar to that as a photographer, as I would travel these vast distances to get the shot. I go there and I get the shot. And then it was like one moment, it was like, wait a minute, you're not spending any time. You're getting in the car and going to the next place. Yeah. And it was painting that really helped me see it and slow down.
Yeah, and I think there's something meditative about just sitting in that environment that you're actually capturing. And I see some photographers do it too, where they'll go out and they will just sit and just take it all in before they even take the shot.
So what is the process? You're going out to paint in a location, you get in your car and you're driving around looking for a spot, you find a spot. What do you do then? What's your process?
Well, and I always say sometimes I find the spot, sometimes the spot finds me, because sometimes you're walking out and you just have to, you just see something and it just clicks. But what normally inspires me to paint is, oftentimes it's in the mountains just west of where I live. And oftentimes it's an atmospheric scene where atmosphere is actually the subject. Sometimes it's light. I'm particularly drawn to backlit scenes. You just get those big atmospheric shapes moving through. But when I find something I want to paint, set up, I paint it. But there's no pressure. To me, that's a study. I'm just studying the effects of light and atmosphere. And then I'll take that study into the studio and develop another studio study of it. And that can be, right around 12 by 16. And then if it calls for it, I'll do an even larger painting from that.
So we've heard painters talk about capturing the essence of a scene, which is interpretive. It's not just painting what you're seeing, it's painting the feeling. What do you do to capture that feeling? Do you sit and just study the area? Do you just try to get in touch with your feelings and how it makes you feel? And then how do you communicate that onto a two-dimensional surface?
I think, like you said, it's a big gray area of capturing the essence of it. And I think to me, what that phrase really means is you can change things for the sake of memory, but you want a few things to remain the same. So if I'm painting a scene, like I paint the Indian Peaks wilderness often, and there's certain areas that are true, I mean, it looks like the Indian Peaks, and people know the Indian Peaks, but I've changed things in the foreground, and there's one painting I did where I changed things so much I thought there's no way this looks like the Indian Peaks. And sure enough, someone came up, saw it in a show and said, I know right where you were standing when you painted that. And I thought, and they knew right where I was standing, and I had made so many changes, but I had succeeded in capturing the essence of the place, at least to this viewer. And I think things that go into it are, maybe you change enough to make it a painting, but not enough to move it from that location to something else. And a lot of times it's atmospheric things that cry out, this is the Indian Peaks.
So as a painter, once you've spent your life learning to paint and studying it and learning composition and color harmony and everything that goes with this, what do you consider as a good painting when you look at a painting now? Because you see things differently than when you were not experienced.
Yeah, and I think, design is always something I'm intrigued by, and not just design, but how an artist moves the viewer through their composition, creating focal points and telling the story subliminally, because most viewers don't know they're being guided through a painting, but it's a subliminal thing, and when you see it done masterfully, there's no doubt that all of these things were considered by the artist. Sometimes innately, I think composing a painting becomes more innate the longer that you do it, and you can compose on the fly, where early on maybe you have to study, okay, where do I need to put this? How am I going to create this focal point and this focal point? But I think when all of that comes together and you get a dynamic design leading the viewer through the story that you want to tell, and for me, the end of that too is how simple you tell the story. How can you tell a story with the fewest amount of brush strokes? To me, that's when it becomes a poetic painting and it has the most impact. There are some paintings where, it's more of an encyclopedic discussion of the landscape. And to me, those don't resonate as much as those little pieces of poetic statement.
What is it about leading the eye? What are the tools that you would employ that you might be able to share with people that help them lead the eye? What kind of?
Well, I think focal points, and you can do it with hard edges versus soft edges. That'll create a focal point. High chroma color versus low chroma color. I mean, that'll create a focal point. And then there's atmospheric elements. So if you want to lead the eye back, and you can do it with linear perspective, atmospheric perspective, but then you're kind of guiding the eye through the painting in a three-dimensional way. So you can guide the eye in a two-dimensional way just from point to point, and then you can guide the eye three-dimensionally. And I think it just comes down to really studying design principles, and over the years I've gotten more and more adept at how to lead the eye through a painting.
So your best advice to somebody who's watching this, they've never picked up a paintbrush, but they know they want to do it. You have the benefit of perspective of being able to look back at what you went through, the mistakes that you made. So if I were to sit with you as a young, maybe young isn't the right word, inexperienced painter, and I'm trying to learn it, what are the steps you're going to tell me to take, and in what order?
Well, number one, and this is particularly true if you're a landscape painter, is look at a landscape, learn to analyze a landscape before you even begin painting. And one way that I do it is separate the light family from the shadow family. If you can start to see a landscape as two separate landscapes, light and shadow, you've simplified that scene by half. And I think, and I teach this to beginning students as well as advanced students, because that allows you to build the structure of this painting without even touching paint to brush or brush to paint. You can contemplate in your head, how am I going to do this? I think what gets overwhelming for young students, new artists, is they look out at a landscape and think, how am I going to paint all million of those colors? How am I going to put all those colors onto this canvas? And it's actually much simpler than that. All you have to do, as I discuss in my videos, is look at the shadows, paint those shadows in a sequential way coming forward, and you've already established the entire structure for that landscape. So that's where, you know, and I teach, I think, had I had that approach early, I think I would have been able to take off and run with that, and perhaps be in a different position than I am now. But so I teach it to beginning students and advanced students.
How did you learn it?
Just by failing a lot, you know, just going out. I think going outside is paramount, but I would go out and make, you know, bad paintings. And I think another thing I joke about with my students is go out and make bad paintings, because that's where you learn. Those are the paintings you learn from. I don't learn anything when I knock it out of the park. You know, I just pat myself on the back and think I'm good, and I'm not. I'm as good as I can be right now, but I'll still make bad paintings, and I'll learn from those bad paintings. So yeah, so if you're a beginning student, go out, make bad paintings, and learn from them.
That's an important thing to understand, because I remember when I was first new at this, I was interviewing Richard Schmid, who is a great artist, and Richard telling me that, you know, his hit rate was, you know, he had so many failures out of every 10 paintings. I don't remember what the number was. And I was actually happy to hear that, because I thought, well, I thought a guy like that just sat down, did a painting, and everyone was perfect. But yeah, that's not the case.
Yeah, you know, I heard him say similar things in the past, which was, I took that as encouragement too. But of course, his level of failure was way beyond my levels of success at that time. But it is nice to hear. And I think the biggest thing to take from that is humility, even at his masterful level. To remain humble and think you can still learn is huge as an artist, I think.
Well, and the landscape can kick your butt.
Oh yeah.
You know, you're trying to create some essence of a scene that no artist can really can really match the beauty of nature. So to be able to create that, it's a constant challenge.
It is, and I almost think there's another element to that, which is the freedom that you have when you're looking at a scene. It's almost, it can be too much freedom, because there's so many things you can do, and there's so many things you could do wrong to kind of destroy that. So I almost think more decisions. I mean, I do some portrait and figure painting too, and the decision making is sometimes made. I mean, there's a face there, yet you have to put the nose where it needs to be and the eyes where it needs to be. With landscape, you can move a tree, a rock, a mountain.
But it still has to look like a tree or a rock or a mountain.
Exactly. Yep. That is the one caveat. But where you place them, you know, it can open up compositional things that you may not be able to achieve with other genres.
Yeah. I suppose the only equivalent in portrait painting would be that, you know, Sargent and others would take someone who was maybe not as beautiful, or may have been somewhat homely, and they would employ a few tricks to make them look a little bit better.
Yeah.
You know, and some of that is brushwork, or, you know, reducing the size of a nose slightly or something.
Definitely, and there's a lot of other correlations with landscape painting. I approach still life and figure painting the exact same way with atmosphere, and which sometimes doesn't make sense, but I was describing this in one of my classes, that if you want someone to look at a vase, you put all your impactful colors there, and you can still gray out the other areas where you don't want them to look. So you're guiding the eye through a still life the same way you're guiding the eye through a landscape.
Yeah. So mentors, who were your mentors, and what specific things did you learn from them?
Well, so most of my mentors, all of my mentors were from books, because largely with the physical part of painting I was self-taught, but I buried myself into art books. So Richard Schmid was one of them, Clyde Aspovig. Those were the contemporary guys I kind of looked at for inspiration. And Edgar Payne, a lot of the California Impressionists, I just loved their work. And then taking back through the French Impressionist movement. So a lot of it was Impressionism. Just how they captured the feel of air was always intriguing to me. So I absorbed as much of that information as I could. And early on, a lot of my art heroes were painting outdoors, so I immediately, jumped outdoors and started painting.
So how did this all begin for you? You have always painted? You were interested in it as a kid?
Yeah, I had always drawn. I drew all the time when I was a kid, and started drawing in colored pencil in high school, and won some scholarships in high school, and so always felt like I had talent. But it wasn't until after college that I first picked up a paintbrush, and at that time, again, all the art that was inspiring me and influencing me, they were oil painters. So I went straight into oil paint, started painting from photos, not the best results, but I felt like there were a few successes in there that kind of inspired me. And then I immediately went outdoors, and the first painting I did outdoors, I thought, well, I got this. And then the next probably 30 were failures. But I immediately started paying dividends because I felt like I was getting better.
Yeah, well, failures are where the lessons come from.
Exactly, yep. So that's how it all started for me, was just painting outdoors. And I was working full-time throughout painting. So I'd work during the day, paint in the evenings and weekends, and sometimes I'd get home at 6 from work, take a little break, start painting about 8, paint from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m., get back up, do it again, and then get up in the mountains on the weekends and paint.
Well, that's what it takes.
Yeah.
It's interesting watching people who will move into full-time painting after a career or after working, and to see the growth that they experience and how rapidly that growth comes once they start putting in 8 hours a day on that. Did that kind of thing happen to you?
Oh yeah. And I used to get the question, after a while, why aren't you doing it full time? And I just think, well, I am doing it full time. It's just that I'm doing work full time too. So
doing two
full-time jobs. But there really is no way to get better. I mean, getting incrementally better as a painter takes so many hours at the easel. Looking back now, it's like, I wonder if I knew now what I knew then, if I would keep painting. And of course I would, but it's just one of those things to relate how many hours it takes to really get to those next plateaus.
So do you have in your head what you would consider to be a pinnacle of success, something that you hope to someday strive for?
Well, I think, you know, from an award standpoint, I mean, it's hard to beat the pinnacle of winning the Plein Air Salon, because that, you know, it's one of those that I think is held up above others because its roots are in plein air painting. But I think most of my personal successes that I strive for have to do with the painting itself. And I think that, you know, as I go through a year of paintings, I can pick out certain paintings where I look at them and I say, that's me, that's what I want to paint. And for me, it's as I mentioned earlier, those simple poetic statements. And I also find that they resonate with others more than some of my, you know, more maybe photographic realism ones. The ones that are these foggy, misty scenes that are really calming. Those are the paintings I love to paint, and they seem to get a lot of recognition too, which encourages me even more to stick with what I really love to do.
So we look back now on artists like Edgar Payne, who you mentioned. If you could spend 20 minutes with him, what questions would you ask?
Oh, I would ask him how he paints those enormous paintings and keeps them loose. Because I think for me, my tendency is to paint large and think it needs more. And he is as succinct in his large pieces as some of his smaller pieces. And I think that's a real talent to be able to, and it's a real vision to be able to do that.
And what's the largest you're painting now?
I've done as large as 48 by 96, so fairly large, and it was rooted in a plein air study. So I worked it up to actually that size, and I really enjoy it, but it is monumentally more difficult to stay brief in a canvas that size. So that's kind of where I'm working toward.
Everything changes when you start painting big.
Yeah, yep, everything changes, and also your thinking changes, because you start to think, well, I need more information now to convey what I want to convey. And again, sometimes it's just the opposite. Sometimes you need less information. But,
right.
You know, my goals moving forward is to really start getting some big canvases out and painting large.
Well, this has been fabulous, Dave. I really appreciate you taking the time today. And any other thoughts before we wrap up that you want to share?
Well, you know, if you're painting in either just starting out or painting for a long time, get outside, you know, analyze the scene before you even get started. It's going to make your paintings easier, and then you can focus on just being an artist. You know, I always liken painting and mixing paint to learning how to use a camera before you can become a photographer, and that's what I think painting is. Learn how to mix paint, learn how to put paint down, and then go out and be an artist.
Yeah, so to that point, that was the next question, is probably better to learn the mechanics of painting indoors before you go outdoors, so you're not trying to learn those mechanics while you're struggling with nature.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, for sure. There's something to that. There's plenty of other things to deal with outdoors, but embrace that part too. You know, embrace that, you know, flies are flying into your canvas occasionally. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can look back and say, you know, that kind of interrupted my experience, but it also adds to it. You know, it adds to the idea that you're outside. I've had bears come wandering up behind me. I've had moose walk right next to me while I'm painting. That is the beauty of being an outdoor painter, is you're part of nature. And they've always been good encounters. There hasn't been any bad encounters with wildlife.
Haven't been eaten by a bear yet.
No, I'm still here. The bear It didn't want anything to do with me. It was grubbing for ants and just happened to wander up, you know, maybe it was 30 feet behind me, and just I was not on its menu and really was not concerned with me at all. So
I think that one of the things I love about plein air painting is I'll walk into my studio and I have all these studies, which are my memories. And there's something different about it than the memories of going through a photo album, right? You know, I can look at any one of those paintings and tell you who I was with, what I was doing, you know, what animal happened to wander in, what the weather was like, how the wind was blowing. And it really informs all the sensations. I suppose because you're spending a couple of hours minimum on a particular scene.
Oh yeah, it's funny that you say that. Before coming here, I was going through a bunch of plein air studies, and my wife was wondering why I didn't put down where they were on the back. And I said, because I know exactly where I was on every, and I have stacks of plein air paintings in my studio, literally stacks. And I was just thumbing through some of them. And I'd pull one out, and like you said, you know exactly where you were, who you were with, what the weather was like. It's better than a diary. And on top of that, there's also good information. Even in a bad plein air painting, which I'm thinking through some of those, and some were quite bad. But even in those, there was a lot of information for future paintings.
Yeah, you can borrow a tree or a snow scene or some other piece from a painting.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's you know, it's really a gift. I do encourage you to write down everything on the back of them, because historians will want to know that in the future.
And right after I thought, yeah, my wife's right again. I should.
They're always right.
Yeah, they're always right. I said, yeah, I probably should write where this was. But
yeah, I actually want to try and get people thinking about putting GPS locations. You can easily go into your phone and find out, because, you know, you think about Dan Pinkham and people like that who are preserving in paintings places that, you know, they'll go out and paint something before the developers come in and destroy it.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be nice to be able in the future to go to a GPS location and go, oh, that's where that, you see where the shopping mall is, that's where that used to be.
Yeah, and I think about that with someone like Edgar Payne. It'd be nice to see some of his more, I mean, some of them, you know, obviously where he was, but some it'd be nice to just look on his painting and say, oh, let's go there. I want to paint that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dave, thank you so much for being here today. And,
thank you.
And it's been a pleasure. Our guest today, Dave Santillanes, and I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazine. Thanks for watching. Well, that is Dave Santillanes from the brand new video, Winter Landscapes, which you can find at painttube.tv. And we have a discount for you. Just use that code today only, and you'll find it in the comments section. Thank you for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.
If painting snow seems intimidating to you, and you're not exactly sure how to approach it, this will be the perfect workshop for you. Hi, I'm Dave Santillanes, and welcome to my workshop. In this workshop, we're going to be talking about snow, but part of that discussion is going to reveal some surprising things about snow. First off, we'll find out just how great a value range is within snow. We often think of snow as just one value, white, but there's a surprising level of value transitions within snow. We're also going to learn that snow is not white, that there are a surprising degree of color changes within snow, and all of that helps develop the form that is snow. And of course, we're going to discuss the other things inherent in a landscape, atmospheric elements, atmospheric transitions from foreground to background. All of that will be included in this workshop. I hope this workshop inspires you to get out there and paint, even if it's in the snow, even if it's in the cold and during the elements, because the satisfaction of capturing that scene on canvas is worth the trouble.